The Birth of the Clinic by Michel Foucault, the act of seeing, the gaze, has the utmost importance. While Foucault introduced the transition from the previous episteme of classification to of the clinic, several parts included the discussion between the visible and the invisible in a variety of aspects. In the system of knowledge that orientates itself toward the topic of life, disease, and death, new concepts can be challenging to explore, especially when multiple senses are included. By using the visibility as a tool for assessing the book, changes as well as similarities could be discovered between different topics. In the 17th to early 18th century, medicine was based on nosology, a system of classification. In that time, people treated disease as invisible species that is fixed, which dwell in human body, creating visible signs and symptoms. Since the species of disease were invisible, classification of disease had to clear out the disturbance in order to find the essence of different species, which is consisted of visible elements that never change, linked directly to the diseases themselves. Three parts of specialization were introduced in the episteme, mapping the disease from the invisible into the visible spaces. The primary specialization is the nosology. The diseases are classified by the similarity of their essence. In this level, the indication of a disease is not disturbed at all, projected on an idealized image. The secondary specialization is the diversification when the disease localizes in human body. In this level, same diseases started to show differences due to the disturbance of the body. The visible elements are not able to directly refer to the disease itself. The tertiary specialization is the transformation created by the society. Changes of the environment might cause the disease to go unnatural. To complete the natural life cycle of a disease, distortions created by, for example, hospitals should be avoided. Apart from the classificatory medicine, which ruled out variables in search of constants, another concept was applied to define something that is unique, an epidemic. In the study of epidemics, it was perceived that every epidemic is unique. They could not repeat themselves. Being a collective phenomenon, it required a multiple gaze. Every visible element perceived by different people are taken into account in order to describe the event without bias, illustrating a collective and coherent image. In comparison of medicine of classes and of epidemics, the former was the decipherment of a type, a determination of hierarchical place, and a search for essential coherence. Yet the later was the analysis of series, the integration of time, and the attribution of a causality. To this point, two different ways of thinking was introduced. One is the medicine of classes. Another is the medicine of epidemics. However, the episteme has started to change in the 18th century. In the 18th century, several clinical schools were established. These clinical schools are only the proto-clinic. They are neither open to the public nor research-oriented. Instead, they were founded for the purpose of education. Its task is not to indicate individual cases with their particular characteristics, rather to show cases that seem most instructive. Typical cases were delivered to clinical schools for students to learn nosology. There are examples for the training of disease recognition. Despite its function being of demonstration but of discovery, clinical schools still enable the examination of the traditional episteme. While methods being shown to students, teachers were put to the test under the gaze. Feasibility were now visible, not dependent on classificatory theories and individuals anymore. This led to the changes in the clinic, the attempt to order medicine on the exercise and decisions of the gaze. In the episteme of the clinic, the disease was no longer invisible. It was regarded as the set of all symptoms, consisted of all visible abnormalities found on human body. Symptoms were the language of diseases and of themselves. They were both the signifier and the signified. Then the language of diseases could be learned by the doctors from their previous experience and gaze. The doctors read symptoms as signs, interpreting what the symptoms referred to. Therefore, a strict language system was needed, in which every word has to be clear in their definition for the translation of symptoms. Although moving the focus into visible field for observation, the medicine of the clinic still shares similarities from the medicine of classification. Because the symptoms of disease is a form of a linguistic type, people began to think diseases as a language, which contains alphabetical order and can be decomposed into basic elements. Like the medicine of classification, the search of the essence was still going on, only the form was changed. Moreover, in the medicine of the clinic, there were several discussions about how to see through and sort out the abundant information that is visible. Doctors believe in a fine sensibility, in which key elements of diseases can be identified in a glance. This glance is similar to the nosology method of seeing. Only few elements are identified, while the others get ignored. Besides the medicine of the clinic, another method was developed, pathological anatomy. Pathological anatomy supported the clinical medicine in three ways. Firstly, pathological anatomy makes the invisible visible. By the realistic shift, a surface gaze of the clinic could now gaze beneath the surface, into organs, tissues, the inside space. Through the dissection of diseased bodies, lesions, the injuries to a person's body were found in organs. While the clinical method being visual-oriented, pathological anatomy provides visual evidence for the symptoms observed over time. With the help of it, diseases were linked to the organic space, and efforts were made to find the origin of the symptoms. The majority of them were mapped onto locations in the body. From here, for the essence of disease, the notion of seat has replaced that of class. Secondly, pathological anatomy enables the projection of the image of lesions back to living bodies. When opening up corpses, the image composed of visible lesions is static. Everything is presented at once in spatial configuration. However, doctors can project their gaze on the patient with the image of corpses, linking the lesions back to the ongoing timeline of disease, ignoring the liveness of the patient and treating it as if one were dead. This involves the extension of perception, such as listening to the sound of percussion or touching in search of lumps. Doctors see the invisible with their hands and ears, extracting information by actively questioning the body. With pathological anatomy, science became independent from symptoms. Symptoms have to be seen, but for science, they could be the visible invisible, felt and read with other senses, visualized in autopsy. Finally, pathological anatomy altered the concept of death. Originally, death was perceived as an indivisible, decisive, irrecoverable event, a point of no return. In here, death was distributed throughout life in the form of separate, partial, and progressive deaths. Death visualizes a relation between life and disease from its immovable standpoint. While life is constantly fighting against death, diseases deviate from it. The sequence of death in where mechanisms were found was observed between organisms under the new concept, helping the doctor to understand the interaction between life and disease. From nosology to pathological anatomy, the gaze on diseases changes continuously. From invisible essence to visible essence. From visible signs to invisible ones. From visible perspective of life to invisible viewpoint of death. In 19th century, the concepts of disease shifted into a new era of pathology. In here, disease is now no more than a certain complex movement of tissues in reaction to an irritating cause. The essence of disease no longer exists. Disease was entirely localized on tissues. Medicine had finally given up the concepts derived from nosology, yet the discussion of the visible and the invisible would go on.